Welcome back to Marketing on Purpose. I'm your host, Michael Fennick, partner at RDB. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by RDB CEO and founder Mario Alonso Tabu and one of our producers in the US, Rima Chowdhury. In the podcast today, we sit down with Tony Effik, Managing Director of Google Display Video and Creative. However, we are not here to discuss Tony's role at Google. Instead, we chat about the organization Tony has co-founded called the Black and Brilliant Advocacy Network, which is a group of people of all backgrounds united in creating a more diverse workforce. Tony answers questions like, why are we not seeing enough diversity in the workforce? How can this change? And how his experience as a Black man has differed living in London and Brooklyn. This is an important conversation to be had, and Tony leaves us with many things to think about and take away. Enjoy. Tony, welcome to Marketing on Purpose. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Michael. Absolutely good. Really, really good. So thank you for having me. It's been exciting to do this.
Can you give us a little bit of your background?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I'd say I wear many hats at the moment. That's a good and a bad thing. That's not a boast. That's actually like a curse in many respects. So, my day job is I'm a global managing director at Google. But the hat I'm wearing today in this conversation is, I think there's two other hats. One is I'm a co-founder of an organization called Black and Brilliant, which is something very close to my heart. I'm a co-founder of that with my wife and a bunch of other passionate people in this space. And also, I've been an adjunct professor at Columbia Engineering for the last 5 years. Digital skills has been really a passion point of mine, and that world cross-fertilizes with my work, obviously at Google. And Black and Brilliant, that's me. They're my hats. Choose one.
You're obviously well educated. Where do you think education's brought you in your career?
It's interesting you say that, because I don't actually think of myself as being well educated. I actually, in many respects, think of myself as being undereducated, because although it might look like I have a lot of credentials, I actually grew up in a lower income neighborhood of South London. And I've essentially assembled an education, in a very scrappy way. So I was in many respects a dropout, but kind of accumulated tools in my toolbox over time. And that's how I think about it. And so, I eventually did get a degree. I eventually did get, postgraduate qualification. I did a whole bunch of courses, and I look at education as being tools in the toolbox. Every few years, I kind of think, okay, I think I need a new hammer. I need a new Phillips. The world's changed a little bit. What else do I need in this toolbox? So it's a ragtag toolbox, but I am a lifelong learner. It's an important part, and I think I'd love to get to this later on. I think every few years, what's missing? Where's the world going? What kind of jobs am I doing around the house? And what kind of new tools do I need to put in there? But in many respects, though, what you will see, for example, in my resume or my LinkedIn is this idea that I use education and tools and knowledge from my career professionally. But in my personal life, I'm also a lifelong learner, and I find it very fulfilling as well, just to kind of learn new things. And every few years, I take on a new task.
That's great background. I think you undersell yourself, Tony.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Black and Brilliant, and I've seen a lot of activity around that. Can you talk about that? Because it seems like you're very passionate about it, but I'd like to learn more.
The core of it was a very simple insight. It was around George Floyd, but it predates George Floyd. And so the idea here was that almost every single boss I've ever had has been a white guy. Mm-hmm. Okay, and many of these white guys are my friends, they're my sponsors, they're people I rely on and I lean on. I've had a couple of white women bosses, one Asian female boss, never had a Black boss before. Never. Okay, and wherever I've worked around the world. And I consider these people to be champions of mine, but they have frequently cited an issue, which is I can't find the Black talent. And it wasn't, and I take them at face value. But equally, I've known lots of brilliant Black people over the years who say they can't find the opportunity. And I'm like, okay, I saw that as an engineering problem, an opportunity to really connect two sides of the problem. They're essentially the most elegant problems. And just to build on that a little bit more, what I'd also found is that every time we had some kind of issue, quote unquote, like a George Floyd, everyone said, well, they were going to build their talent pipeline. That'll take a year. They'd bring in a lot of junior people. The junior people wouldn't last the next year because they couldn't see anyone in the middle or senior. And then we were back to the talent pipeline problem. And I said, okay, what would happen if I did a hashtag called Black and Brilliant, where I tagged people on LinkedIn so people could just search the hashtag and find people who everyone else felt was brilliant. essentially passing on equity. And then I asked people to do exactly the same. And we started that on LinkedIn and it went viral. It was, I think probably about 10,000 people got tagged in the end, hundreds of thousands of people saw it. And then we said, between my wife and I who were thinking about this, what do we do? And then people said, let's jump on the phone and have a call. And there's the other important part of this, is a very personal part of this, which is I'd done stuff in very small ways before. And I remember my wife saying to me, well, George Floyd, we should do something. And I'm like, man, I can't do another thing. But our daughter was the real inflection point. My wife said, look, Nia, who is our oldest, she was like, she's 13 and she was becoming politically aware, culturally aware. And she was like, we got to go and march. So we marched. I live in Brooklyn. A lot of the marches literally past my house. And then, we felt we needed to do something a little bit more. And I felt if not me, it wasn't that I was the top of the business or anything, but I was in a position where I had equity, I had relationships, I had knowledge and experience. If not me, then who? Why not me? Why not us? And my wife and I got together, and that's what we've been doing. So Black and Brilliant is essentially the genesis. That was the genesis of it, but it's essentially a program where we partner with a loose affiliated network of people around the world to try and help people upskill, connect to opportunity, network. It's been great. It's been incredibly fulfilling and successful.
I agree with Michael. This sounds super intriguing. And first of all, thank you for doing it. And it's so needed in the world. You said, okay, there is a pipeline problem in between getting the right talent, or the call it talent, to enterprises, businesses, whatsoever. Did you find that true, or could you still find, even though the leaders that you were well connected might have been well intended, but there still were some biases that then still hurt that pipeline or that connection? What was the sense that you got in the last year?
Really interesting question, Mara, because I think there wasn't one answer to that. It's such a complex problem, and as you move around the world, the problem is a little bit different. One of the things I always say, I was born in Nigeria, grew up in the UK, worked across Europe. I've worked in Austria, Germany, many places like that, across Asia, and now in America. And the notion of Black and that problem is a little bit different in different places. But then also the notion of the problem is very different as you move. Let's just take advertising as an example, up through the organizational hierarchy. So now if you think about it, the entry-level jobs in advertising, the nature historically about how those jobs were recruited was the first blockage, okay? Because frequently there was a lot of, my friend knows this person, my cousin's friend, my boss's, whatever, there was that piece happening. Then there was a whole thing, which I think was a big issue, and I was a victim of it as well, and also a perpetrator of it, which is like, we all know it. In advertising, we used to have this thing where somebody had the skills for the job, and then you do the last meeting for culture fit. Remember, is this person the culture fit? I did 100 of, if not 1,000 of those interviews and said, will this person fit in? And if you think about it, what does that really do and say? That's basically saying, is that person one of us? What we started to talk about in Black and Brilliant, it's not culture fit, it's culture add. Okay, which is like, is this what's missing in this room? And is this person bringing a different flavor, a different story, a different perspective? And I feel some of the missteps we've had in creativity over the years have been because of culture fit, not culture add. Another one was the chemistry meeting. Think about what the chemistry means. That in my years in agency, what you would typically do is like, oh, there's this client who really is into this sport. He skis here, goes to this kind of place. Let's find the person that marries to that person. And then frequently that person wouldn't end up, the people we're talking about wouldn't end up in the room. So you have a problem of entry level. And then there's a specific, also additional issue, I think is specific to, I would argue, London, and less London, but definitely New York, San Francisco, LA, the central hubs for advertising in the United States, which is typically most African Americans, a lot of people, usually the first or second generation to go to college, yeah? They go into college with huge amounts of debt, because a lot of them qualify for something called Pew Grants, which basically means you're on a lower income. Everyone comes out of college with a huge amount of debt, but African Americans in particular come out with even more debt. And then what invariably happens, and I'll talk about this as well, is that they end up studying the courses that pay the least. And then where are the advertising jobs? They're all in the cities that are the most expensive to live in. And we don't pay the best salaries at the beginning for advertising. So you're one of these guys, you're like, man, I'm not doing that. And it's so hard to get in anyway. And nobody looks like me. Plus, I've been rejected 4 times already. And I think those are some of the issues at the bottom. Then I think we've got issues around the middle, which it's just hard. We have this concept called breaking through the middle, which is like you get in, and then, after a while, once you get through to the middle ranks, everyone can kind of do the job. And then it becomes about, does this person look like a leader? Does this person look like the kind of person who we think can run the team? Do I like this person? Do I want to, there was a thing called the layover test in the States, which is like, if I get caught on the flight and we have to do a layover and I'm in the airport for 2 hours, do I want to hang out with this person? I don't want to do that late night pitch with this person. And I think invariably people in advertising have chose to kind of like bring people in like themselves. So those have been some of the issues, but they're multi-pronged. Sorry about a long-winded answer there. Hope that answers your question, Mary.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. I mean, it raises so many more questions, but
yeah.
that gives a good overview of, okay, this is not an easy solve, right? There is economic reality, social reality, business reality to it.
And also biases, right. But also the biases sit on both sides, yeah? Because sometimes I remember when I started from the business, my first major agency in London, it was the major agency at the time. And I remember walking into this cathedral, art gallery type environment and being hugely intimidated by the whole experience and not thinking I had a voice or I could be myself. I couldn't speak up. And I remember the first meeting being super nervous to speak as one of the more junior people in the room. The second meeting being even more intimidated because I didn't speak in the first one. and it just kept going and going and going. And I just couldn't be myself and speak for myself because I was in this, what I would consider to be an alien environment. I didn't have the words or the inner voice or the confidence to express myself. So I think part of it is about, on the young Black talent side, is about giving them the confidence that they can walk into a room, be themselves. It took me time to become confident enough with seniority that I could actually just be myself in the room and understand that my voice was a valid voice as much as anyone else's in the room. So there's that side of it as well, just to touch on that.
Yeah, I think, just to jump in, I think that what I've seen in the last maybe 5 or 8 years is a move towards authenticity. And we bridge that to, for me in advertising, it was, you didn't go to the right school. That was one of the biases, just as being a white guy in the industry. But let me bridge that to where you think and how important social media is today for carrying your messages like yours, and then overall.
I don't think a lot of the movements that we've seen in recent times could have happened without social media. And I use social media broadly in all its forms today. If you think about it, if you wanted to get a message across previously, there was always this intermediary, yeah? There was a gatekeeper, whether it be the editor, the programmer, the scheduler, whoever, magazine, newspaper, television, whatever it meant, there was this middle person who essentially was a filter. And you couldn't aggregate any kind of community or movement, in fact, without going through that intermediary. So that intermediary needed to buy into what you believed in. With the disintermediation of that intermediary, I think is what has allowed these kind of movements to become much more important. And to self-organize, it's much more lightweight. We ourselves started at Black and Brilliant on LinkedIn, and I was able to see people like me, connect with people like me, and then mobilize people like me. Yes, I'd say absolutely central to what we've been trying to do.
To go back to the empowerment of Black talent, Black business, if you like, give us a sense of where we are. What is the lay of the land? Are there Black agencies arising? Are there incubators focusing on Black talent or Black startups? Like, is there a movement and a dynamic, as we can see with, for example, Impact or with female empowerment? Or is that still under the rug and still not anywhere close to where it needs to be?
I think that there is definitely been a movement. And I think if you look at, I'm a big fan of history. I'm a history buff, and it's kind of one of my passion areas. If you look at the span of, let's take US history as an example, it's very different from what's happening in Europe or even in Africa, but take US history. There's been many false dawns before where everyone felt this was the moment where everything's going to change, and it's, what the Martin Luther King thing is, that the arc of moral justice bends upwards, or a phrase like that, which they're basically implying everything gets better. And so after the Civil War in America, we had a period of something called Reconstruction, where basically Northern soldiers were down south, everybody got the vote, males got the vote, but there was Black entrepreneurship, Black political power, there was people in Congress in Washington, there was state congresses. There was a real flourishing. But there was also reactionary forces after Abraham Lincoln was murdered, assassinated. There was then a retrenchment back, which led to Jim Crow. And really, African Americans didn't see the same level of political power, economic power maybe, but political power, until the 1960s. It was like that span of time. It was, 70, 80 years of time before things reverted to what they were. So in many respects, if you think about it, if you think of, Civil War, then you think about civil rights in the 60s, and then you think about where we are right now, it's kind of like a third cycle of improvement. So I think in American history, I think we're at a key point. We see massive change in demographics, which I think is causing a lot of the discomfort in certain sections of the population. But in general, what I would say in regards to the ascendancy of this idea, and what is the idea? The idea is that everybody should get a fair shot according to their talent. Yeah. So I think that there is a genuine movement for that. I think in corporate circles and academic circles and business circles. I think the issue for me is that going to take us a generation? And are the forces of resistance going to gain strength? I think that I would prefer it not to take a generation, which is why we've been focused on these ideas we call accelerators. And these accelerators are essentially about saying, yes, in the long term, and also I don't want to just see a few people up at the top here. And then you can say, oh, what about Michael Jordan? We don't all need to be Michael Jordan or Beyonce, or Jay-Z,
Yeah.
I'm talking about just the average guy in my neighborhood, the average guy in an office. I want to see that person be okay. Because you don't always need to be an A++. Okay, you should just be okay to be like a B+ and have the same job as everyone else. And so what I've tended to find is that everyone has to be an A++ just to get in the door. So the accelerator idea is a simple one, and I think it's a powerful idea, which is this. Just say that there's not a shortage of the talent. The talent is out there. It's just not in the spaces that we need it to be in. So let me just bring that to life a little bit. I was lucky that I happened to come of age in advertising that the internet happened, when no one was an expert. And I was like, yeah, exactly. I looked at Netscape Navigator and I'm like, man, if no one's an expert in that, that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
And then that's it. And that was what I call my on-ramp. Then social media happened, the next on-ramp. And then the big on-ramp right now is AI. Okay. So you then say, okay, who's in AI? And clearly there's an underrepresentation. Then you start saying, okay, well, what kind of person should do well in AI? Well, the kind of person who should do well in AI is people who've studied STEM, mathematical engineering type courses. And then you look specifically at African Americans, and I keep going back to the other one from the UK. I'll talk about the UK in a second. The number of graduates in general in the US that are African American keeps going up every year. The number of STEM graduates in the US goes up every year. But what are they studying in STEM? They're studying mechanical and civil engineering, which, don't get me wrong, those are great courses. But it means that you have the technical ability to do higher order STEM type work. But it also happens that those are the two worst paying STEM courses when you graduate. And it's like, so if you could do that, why couldn't you do computer science or software engineering or, financial engineering or whatever it was? And so we started to say, okay, if the future of AI has a core component, which is engineering, why don't we change these people's lanes, and move them, just adjust them a little bit. Or you could actually already have done, you could be in IT, you could be doing certain types of computer programming, but you're just not in AI. So we have partnered with Code Academy, which is an online training platform, a coding platform. Yeah, so Zach Sims is the founder of that. Him and I spoke at an event for the United Nations on digital skills, and we hit it off, and then we've decided to partner. So we're taking out roughly about 100 people over 10 weeks. We've got some amazing coaches. So in addition to getting access to Code Academy, we're going to give you some of the best brains in the field. We're going to just give you a big bear hug of kind of like coaching love and confidence boosting so you can change lanes. And so we're just literally announcing the successful applicants this week. And we've got some amazing people. I have one guy who's a PhD in biomedical research, but feels the future of that industry is going to be heavily influenced by AI. Absolutely correct. But where would that person get access to that? Well, they're going to get access to it from Black and Brilliant Code Academy. Yeah.
Fantastic. Tony, if there's any way we can support you in any capacity, let us know.
I would love that. Would love that. The other important part of it, sorry, just to add on that, that's really, thank you for that. I appreciate that. And I think that what we're also not trying to do is just to create clones of people who are already in that business.
Right.
Because what we think is that there's a protective measure, which is that we feel we should have these people in these top jobs. There's an offensive measure to make sure people in these top jobs. There's a defensive measure to say, well, there are lots of jobs that are going to be eradicated by AI, so this is make sure people are protected. And then there's a social component, which is to say there's a lot of bias that is in these systems. So let's just make sure that the right people are at the table when decisions are being made. And so it also does that piece as well. So we have 4 pillars. One is about the core programming, another one's about responsible AI and social justice. Another one's about user experience design and creativity. And then the last one is about the business of AI and getting started. And so hopefully we aim over 10 weeks to kind of move these people up a bit. Yeah, so we're very excited by that, super excited by it.
So in today's world, do you think that diversity is represented enough in marketing and media?
No, that's a simple answer to that question. But let's just be clear about the answer to that, though, because I think increasingly as you go up, when you go down to an organization, and I can talk about the UK, I can talk about America, and I can talk a little bit about East Asia to be except I'm not work over there. I think that it's not represented enough. I think we're starting to see some improvements at the lower level, the junior level. I think we are seeing some improvements at the mid-level, still massively behind, but the mid-level is where the big problem is. Because if you think about it, you come into an organization for the first time, if you see no one that looks like you at the top, that's an issue. See no one that looks like you in the middle, that's an issue. Now, if at the time where people in the middle, you're trying to find people for senior leadership positions, and there's no one in the middle, that's also an issue. So you can see how there's a knock-on effect. And so I think for me, we focused a lot on mid-level, and we call it breaking through the middle, because if you can fix the mid-level problem, then all of a sudden you've solved it for the junior people and the senior people. That's not to say there's not big problems elsewhere, but that has really been my focus. And it's a really important point, because when you get up to that middle thing, it's very rarely about skill setting, because depending how you define the middle, because you need the opportunity to become a leader. You need that opportunity to start managing. You need the opportunity to start pitching and controlling, looking at budgets and timelines and that kind of stuff, and project management, team management. Those are skills you kind of need permission to step into. Once you've done that, then all of a sudden you qualify for a whole bunch of stuff, but just getting to that next step. And what tends to happen, because I went through this myself, where I sat on the same level for many, many years. That's why when you look at my resume, you think he's done all these things. But I had to work for years to get the evidence that I could do that stuff, the proof I could do that stuff. And so frequently, and I think this happens to women as well, is that you are hired and given that based on proof, not potential. Big difference. So I had to do a bunch of stuff to just show, man, I can do this. Here's my certificate. Here's my evidence. Here's my case study. Here's my reference. Here's the thing I do on the side. Here's that campaign I did. And so you have to create all of these credentials, rather than sometimes I've seen people just get hired because, man, I think that guy, Tony, could do the job. He looks great. And then this person gets the job just based on the potential of that person.
I think one of the challenges that, and you actually mentioned it, right, in terms of leveling ground and having equal opportunity. And now with International Women's Day, there was a lot of a topic in terms of equal opportunity for all. But then when you go back to history and what you talked about, how long it took in the 70 years or 80 years, where there was no economic or educational empowerment for an entire population, if you like. Do you feel that, and I know this is difficult to answer, but do you feel equal opportunity and just leveling the ground is enough? Because if we do this, does it actually allow people to move up, or do we actually need to change the odds a bit and give more opportunity and more support to the ones that did not have it in the past?
It's interesting, because I think in the United States in particular, I keep going back there because this is where the conversation is the hottest, is that there is a difference in 2 words: targets versus quotas. Okay, so now let's just define a quota is compulsory, obligatory, and the United States has a dirty word.
Right.
I put, in the Black and Brilliant Advocacy Network, we debate this quite a lot. I don't think it's a dirty word, and I'll explain why before I explain what target is. So target in my mind is an organization, an institution saying, here's what we're going to go for. Teams go and do it, okay? Now, if you don't hit it, it's not an issue in many respects. If you do hit it, then great, okay? But quota means if you don't hit it, it's a mandate, you've got no choice. Now, it was Martin Luther King who, and I'm going to paraphrase him, he was saying, because there's been this systemic issue for hundreds of years, we should actually have a system that rectifies this and is enforced governmentally through legislation. The question in my mind, though, is that never really entered the corporate world. It was always in government structures and that kind of stuff. And you get some of that, though, at the bigger Fortune 500 companies where they do think about supply diversity and all that kind of stuff. In my mind, I think that I'm of the mind that companies should be setting themselves targets, and those targets should be things that they incentivize their leadership on. Okay, now, I don't think it should come from legislation. Now, the reason I say that is that although I would personally feel comfortable with quotas, I know a lot of Black people around the world who wouldn't feel comfortable with that. Let me tell you why. The reason why they don't feel comfortable with it, some of them, some do, some don't. Well, some people don't feel comfortable with it because they feel that, hold on, it's going to look like I didn't earn the right to be here. That I'm only here in this job because I was quote unquote a diversity hire, as opposed to, this brilliant person that I really am. So some people don't feel comfortable about that, and then you just don't get the type of work, you don't get the credit and the respect. The flip of that argument, in my mind, though, is that if you don't make it a mandate, people may or may not. The targets are set every year and ignored. We have our primary, secondary, tertiary targets. So I think, for me, my personal view is quotas make sense, but I accept that probably the best way in the corporate world to do it, where maybe the general consensus is around targets. So now with that in mind, I think if you incentivize people, now, there are some people around the world in different types of companies, and I've met and talked to lots of people across the world in Black and brilliant, who say, well, oh no, but sometimes when you set a target like that, people feel, and they say this indirectly, subliminally, almost, feels like we're lowering the bar. Okay, are we having to lower the bar to let people in? Now, let me explain why I don't think that's the case. Let's think about it. What was the world before and after that target? The world before that target was that you were not looking for the best person in the market to do that job. You were only recruiting on a certain pool of people. But post that target, you're saying you have to look at the full pool of people to fill that job. So in my mind, after target setting, you're in a world where competition and the bar actually is raised because you're looking at the whole talent pool, not a portion of the talent pool, which is kind of what used to happen before in my mind.
Right.
Now, but there is an issue with this now. And let's say, for example, so I have a lot of people who contact me and say, hey, Tony, do you know anyone who could do this role, who's a global CFO level, or could be a CEO of 600 people or whatever? And frequently the answer I have is not that exact profile, because when I was in agencies and I looked behind me, there wasn't a lot of people behind me coming up who were getting the experience who could say, damn, I've got the proof to do that. Because remember, we weren't getting hired on potential, we were getting hired on proof. And but what I have found, a little bit like our AI idea, is that there are transferable skills from other industries. So I moved successfully from working in an agency to working in an entertainment company. I was still a strategist. I actually just do the same thing. The jobs I do, I'm pretty much still doing the same thing. I'm a problem solver strategist. I still, do these left-right diagrams and,
figure it out.
Slides and yeah, it's the same thing. So there's a bunch of people where we can change their lane very easily, but we've got to look more widely, than where we are right now. So if you're looking for, is this person got 10, 15 years in the agency environment, so they're ready to do this next agency leadership job. There are people, but you got two options. One, you take a bet on someone and hire them for potential. You know that they're going to take some time, and I've seen lots of people get that support who are non-Black. Or you find someone with transferable skills and you bring them into the business, and I've seen that work incredibly well.
Sounds like long-term mentorship, right?
Yeah, both of them need mentorship. Yeah, I think the long-termness depends really on clearly the seniority and the scale of the job. But I know people who got CEO jobs and then were assigned an executive coach who literally flew into town every week to sit with them a day a week so they could get through the job the first couple of years.
Going back to the notion that has been kind of a theme, especially in the last couple of years with the social movements, I think there's a distinction between believers and builders. There are people that will jump on the quote unquote bandwagon, but they're not the people to make institutional change.
Correct. Yeah. Absolutely. So true. Yeah, I think, the way I think about that construct is I'm borrowing from Ibram X. Kendi, the thinker, the guy, he wrote a great book, which is How to Be an Anti-Racist. And his main argument, which is going to echo what you just said, is this idea that people say, it was the opposite of someone who's racist, the typical answer is, I'm not racist, yeah? That sounds like the opposite, but actually that's not the opposite, because that person is passive. The opposite of a racist is an anti-racist. Somebody who's not racist is essentially passive. They believe, and I think it's very rare to meet someone in the agency world who's an out and out, or in business in general these days, at least in metropolitan centers around the world, who's an out and out racist. It's very rare for someone to say, yeah, I've got my flag and I'm a racist. You just don't get that a lot. Yeah, at least they won't admit to it. So most people believe, but do most people build? Do they think, but do they do? And there's a big difference in that. And I think what we struggle with is that people think that the only change that can happen is going to come from corporate leaders and government. You know, it's like, those guys at the top, they're not doing anything. But the question is what are you doing? What's your personal commitment to this? You know, and the story I love to talk about, just to give you an example, it's completely unrelated, but it'll bring it to life a little bit, is a story around David Bowie, of all people. David Bowie grew up in South London, there where I grew up. And he was at the peak of his fame. Okay? And around that time, MTV had started. There's not many interviews you'll see online about David Bowie. He just didn't do a lot of publicity. But he had agreed to do an interview with early MTV. Okay, and the thing that people forget about MTV is at the very beginning of MTV in its early days, it did not allow Black artists to be on MTV. Highly controversial, okay?
I had no idea.
This was in the early 80s, but the interview in particular, so David Bowie agrees to do an interview with MTV. So they're over the moon. They're going to, you know, and so it's top billing, it's live, etc. They choose their best journalist, their reporter. And then David Bowie uses that interview to talk about their lack of representation. He actually says, the thing I'm fraught about is why you don't have Black artists on TV. They were scandalized and embarrassed. And very soon after that, not just because of that, because there was a bunch of other stuff going on at the same time, they started to introduce these franchises like Yo MTV Raps, Cribs, things that become iconic shows on MTV. But David Bowie was an example of somebody who wasn't just a believer, he was a builder. He wasn't just not racist, he was anti-racist. And he used his platform, but others didn't have the platform to actually drive for change. And so all of a sudden, what we now historically think of as MTV came to be. And it was not just because of that move, but he used some of his privilege, some of his equity in order to drive that change. And so that's what I mean by, are you a builder or just a believer?
Do you have to go back to your experience also with advertising and being a strategist? So we talked about representation in media. There's a lot of cost marketing now out there. Do you see some truly anti-racist campaigns, communication, or is it all still, can you say blackwashing? No, that's not the right word, right?
No, that's a good word. I think that's that's an appropriate word. What I felt we had around Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, around that time period from, I don't know, around June, July, all the way through to August, September last year, where brands felt they had to say something, and whether they put a post up or they did Blackout Monday, whatever it was, and it was episodic, it was ephemeral, it was for the moment, and it wasn't heartfelt. I think people saw through that. I think right now, and I think it's been the case for probably 10 years, and I think it's only increasing, is that brands have to have purpose. And you have to have purpose, and you have to believe in something, because the product itself, frequently in most categories, is a commodity, yeah? We know that. It's been that way for a while. And I think what Gen Z and younger, they want brands that they can believe in, but they don't want it just to be in your mission statement. They don't want it just to be in an ad, because very quickly with social media, you know, they can unravel that, and it's all over your community, and you get exposed. And so I think what Nike did with Kaepernick was savvy and smart. There was some cynicism in it, to be quite honest, and some calculation in it, but that's what they believe in. That was really what they believe in, and that the people, their community, was on the side of Kaepernick. And so they felt they had no choice but to stand up, you know, and then they were rewarded with it. There was a little bit of a fear at the beginning, but they stood up and then they supported Kaepernick, and their audience, their community saw that. They joined in and supported it. And obviously those who didn't got pissed.
Yeah, and ultimately it changed not entirely, right? But if you look at the last Super Bowl and the very confused messaging that they sent across in all different directions, but suddenly it's 180-degree turn, right? So now social justice is there. They're talking about hiring Black coaches and presidents, and everything is around, like you had Black representation with the artists and the referees. Yeah, I really believe that moved a lot.
I had to look at their stock price over time, because I remember at the time studying it, and I remember seeing it dip on the day, and then it just kept going up and up. And they've got other issues, don't get me wrong, they're not a perfect company, but that moment, the calculation of it, and there was there's a hard-headed business part of it as well, just to say that, if you believe in purpose, what does our community believe in? What does our talent believe in? And do we believe in that? And if you believe in that and you speak from the heart about that thing, there is an intersection between commercial interest and ethical or moral interest, however you want to term that.
One last personal question on that matter. Tony, you don't have to answer that, right? Because maybe it's not easy, or how, just really because I'm interested, how is your experience? How does it differ from London to New York?
Yeah.
And are you even alienated within the Black community because you're British, you come from the UK? Are you immediately part of that? How does that dynamic work?
Yeah, that's really interesting. As I said to you at the beginning, being Black in different places is different, okay, by definition. What I think was really interesting, and I don't think I've got like a full perspective in America because I clearly haven't been everywhere.
How long have you been in New York now?
I've been in New York just coming up, it'll be 11 years this year. So it's gone pretty quickly. So it's interesting. I think the key difference between the US and, so let me be more specific, the key difference between London and New York is that the opportunities in New York are bigger. And so you'll see far more senior people here who are Black. And I use the term Black specifically as opposed to African-American, yeah? Because I'm not African-American, I'm Black, okay, all right. So, and in fact, I'm a specific type of Black, which you can Black British or Anglo-Nigerian or Nigerian-British, whatever you want to call me. So we have different labels, but call me citizen of the world, depending what day of the week it is. But I'm from Nigeria, but British raised, and I live in New York. What's interesting here is that in the UK, cultural assimilation, people living, hanging out, marrying each other, is at a higher level. People go to the same neighborhoods, they live in the same, they get married to each other, they work with each other. But the issue in the UK is that we don't see a lot of seniority, okay, in the corporate or the business world. There's just not a lot of people who are, the power base just kind of isn't what it could or should be, based on the representation, the education levels, and the size of the population in London, which is very high. You come to America and it's almost diametrically opposed, which is to say that the cultural assimilation, that people were actually hanging out and living together and marrying and being buddies and etc., is lower, but you see people in higher positions. Not as many as there should be, but there are more. There's a more powerful part of the political and economic system, and so that is interesting. And then and so it's kind of like it's a trade-off. And so when I came to the US, I always used to think, because if you have an English accent in America, regardless, people give you a few extra IQ points. Just you sound so, because for some reason Americans think people from England are smart, which is not always the case, believe me. But the flip side of it is that if you're Black, they think it's the opposite. You're not smart. So the issue is, I was like, you get 20 extra IQ points if you have an English accent, but you lose perceptually IQ points if you're Black. I thought, what's the balance? What's interesting though is that in the end, the Black thing is much more powerful. So I'm just talking about people's perceptions. And so I see a lot of English people who do incredibly well over here. It does mean though that even in Black circles that there is a distinction, because I haven't had that experience. I didn't grow up here. I don't know a lot of but there's a lot of commonality as well, because similar problems I faced in London affect problems people face in New York. So there is commonality, but there is difference. People don't think of me as being exactly that. My kids are different though, because they now have grown up here. So it's a slightly different experience. So it's interesting. It's interesting to see how it works. And also, you remember that the universe that is being Black in America contains so many different subgroups, social levels, language groups. Exactly. And then the difference between being an elite person in Atlanta versus being somebody, kind of hustling in some in Brownsville and in Brooklyn is very different. And I think the same exists in the UK. I think that one of the other things that's really important about the UK is because of something I'm a huge fan of, because of the education system, state-sponsored education, because of the National Health Service, there are just certain things in life you don't have to think about. So I think you do get accelerated education.
Yeah.
You know, it's not as polarized. It's not like a class-based thing in the same way that you don't need some funds to be able to access key things. And so the average standard of education, particularly amongst immigrant groups in the UK, is incredibly high, incredibly high. So, you know, we have, you know, particularly in the African community, West African community, we have incredible academic achievement there, which I'm so proud of. You know, you have the kind of the tiger mom dad mentality. People don't really associate that. So we have, you know, the Indian community, the South Asian community, and what's mostly the English-speaking West African communities. We have a massive education attainment in the UK in subjects that you typically want to associate in America with Americans doing, because it's free of charge and we haven't established some of those biases. We have different biases, don't get me wrong, but I think the key difference is that this is an immigrant population in Europe. It's new, it's fresher. We're like the third or fourth generation now. And I think there's also another really key distinction that I sometimes have to explain to people. You have to make a choice in Europe to be a racist. Okay, do you want to do that? In America, at certain points in its history, it was government policy to be a racist.
And education,
You know, it was like, it was institutionalized. It was like, they're just certain things you just weren't allowed to do. We really, even in the UK, when we had certain laws that were biased against people of color, they weren't specifically targeted towards people of color. And so I think we are deinstitutionalizing racism, I think, in the US. Whilst in somewhere like the UK or in most of continental Europe, what we're trying to do is to remove individual differences around that. Yes, there's government policies, but it's very rare to find a policy that was there are the examples of policies, but it's very rare to find a policy that's specifically directed. You guys are going to get this because you are this. That's not to say it's much better, because we have our own issues there. I think it's worse if someone chooses to be a racist as opposed to the government forcing them to be a racist. But there are different types of problems.
Thank you for sharing, Tony. It's very insightful.
I appreciate it.
It's so interesting and it's so inspiring to hear you and to learn more about this. Tell us a bit now about your work at Google, your work within AI, driving innovation. What is it exactly that you do? And you talked about trying to already see the next big thing and becoming an expert in it.
Yeah.
What do you see? What are the trends that you are currently pursuing?
I'm not going to go too much into the Google stuff, but I'll give you like a generic view of how I'm thinking about the media and advertising landscape. Particularly talk about it from the lens of previous jobs I've done, which is to really think about go-to-market, communications, product market fit, that kind of stuff. I have a point of view about planning that when I was at RGA, I used to talk a lot about, which is this idea about the different schools of strategy of planning, what's happening in these different schools. You know? So if you think about it, I was frequently in the room where the CMO was at the front of the room, and then there'll be multiple agencies in the room. And then there was a brand planner who was all about, here's the single thing you could say. Then there was a media planner who was essentially about mathematical optimization of reach. There was a digital planner who was essentially about customer journey optimization. Where do you get engagement? There was a social planner who was frequently thinking about how do you mobilize a community and connect with a community. And what used to happen was that the head of that table was the brand planner, yeah? The brand planner was usually the person who the CMO looked to and considered themselves to be,
who had the North Star, right?
Who had the North Star, and everyone had to kind of like line up underneath that person. And I've done all of those jobs I just listed, by the way, at some point in my career. So I remember, because many of you know this, is that when you're in an agency meeting in particular, the account guy gets up and says, hey, thank you, Mr. Klein. My team is here today, particularly if it's a cross-agency meeting. Then they introduce, sometimes the brand planner will then say, okay, let me tell you what the North Star is and where we're going. And then really the crescendo of that meeting used to be creative director would then stand up and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. It's very madman-like, yeah? And then what would typically happen is that the meeting wouldn't be long enough for the media planner or the the measurement person to speak. They get cut off before the end of the meeting. Now that made sense when distribution, channels, data was less important. Yeah, because it was like, what the most important thing was that singular message. And if all you were going to do is create a TV spot, maybe some print ads, and the format didn't change, and you didn't think about data too much apart from getting your Nielsen number at the end, then that made complete sense. But that hegemony of the brand planner and that form of thinking, I think, is over. And the reason is if you think about it, the sponsor of that model, because the single most important thing for the CMO was the message, okay? But the CMO's very job is changing. So the CMO, the single most important thing, the CMO's job is getting conflated with the CTO and the CIO, and the CMO now needs to think about their data stack. They need to think about supply chains and demand chains and how that all syncs. They need to think about ecosystems, how all of those work. So just having that, just singular message is still important, but it's not the most important thing you need to think about right now. Because we're in an age now where you need to create these systems. So the word ecosystem is important, but people forget the word system in ecosystem, and system thinking is important, where you need bits to work together and you need to design that. And those structures now, I think we've got that smart on the demand side, but on the supply side and supply chains, we're digitizing supply chains now. And I think the DTC companies almost famously done this, where they essentially put inventory in factories, et cetera, and attach logistics, attach them to websites and apps, you order, and the whole thing's end to end. Every CMO needs to think in that way right now. And so the existing brand planner has been the custodian of that. It doesn't really work for me anymore. So as the CMO's role changes, so does the nature of the counsel and guidance that person's going to need. It's not going to, that changes the architecture of that. I don't think we're 100% there yet, but if you look at some of the most recent CMO hirings and the type of people they're looking for, it's not the type of people that came before. And they're going to want different people guiding and advising.
Okay, guys, we've got 3 minutes left. Let me do some rapid fire takeaways and questions, kind of the standard. If you could solve one problem, what would it be?
Social equity. I think, most of our world's problems come from greed and not being fair.
What advice would you give your younger self? Rewind 15 years.
I give the same advice I give to young people. Find something hard to do that makes you look different and gives you objective difference.
Tony, it's been wonderful.
If people want to learn more and want to support your movement, want to get involved, where can they reach out? Where can they learn more? Where should we bring them?
Well, the two places I'd recommend, you can go to our website, blackandbrilliant.org, or you can find us on LinkedIn, the Black and Brilliant Advocacy Network.
We will drop those in the links below. Thank you so much today for listening to RDB's podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please consider leaving us a rating and a review. Also, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and follow us on Instagram at rdb.agency and on Twitter at rdbagency. Thank you once again for listening. We'll see you next time.